To show you how easy it is to file a claim with Geico, we hired a scary movie victim.
Oh no, a tree fell on my car, and there's only one thing to do. Trip over my own feet and pull myself across the lawn while yelling help at a barely audible volume.
Sorry to interrupt, but you filed a claim with Geico, so you've got a designated claims team to help you.
This Geico sounds suspiciously reassuring. Are you sure I don't end up getting surprised with an unexpected twist?
Just that your Geico team will always be there to keep you updated.
No!
What is it?
Oh, nothing. I just didn't see that coming.
Geico. Great service without all the drama.
Peacock fuels your true crime obsession with exclusive new originals like John Wayne Gacy, Devil in Disguise.
He said to me, Klaus can get away with murder.
Dr. Death, the undoctored story.
This guy's dangerous.
And Epstein's shadow, Ghislaine Maxwell.
She inherited Jeffrey Epstein's secrets.
There was this whole other world going on.
Plus the most bingeable crime series, Buried in the Backyard and Snapped. And with the Dateline 24/7 channel that's always on.
Did you want her dead?
You can't not obsess. Sign up now at peacocktv.com.
It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman, and this show is brought to you by SubashTechnosis.com. If you need any kind of website design, search engine optimization, data entry, content writing, press releases, even customer service. If you need somebody to handle your customer service phone calls and emails and stuff, check out SubashTechnosis.com. You can also check them out on Facebook at Subash Technosis LLC. If you contact Subash, okay, and you want to hire him, make sure you mention the Opperman Report. I've known Subash for over 10 years, and that's how you get a good deal. We have today H.P. Albarelli, Hank Albarelli. He's the author of a book, A Terrible Mistake, The Murder of Frank Olson, and the CIA's Secret Cold War Experiments. Hank, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. Can you tell
You're welcome.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Who is Hank Albarelli?
Who is a mystery, huh?
Yeah.
I'm a writer, investigative reporter. I've written several books, numerous articles, a lot for various websites. Done quite a bit for the website Truth Out. I'm not sure what else you'd like to know. I'm in my 60s age-wise. I've written for about 20, 25 years. Prior to that, I worked in Washington, D.C. for about 13 years. Worked for the government in both the private sector. Grew up in Burlington, Vermont. And currently, I'm a bit of a nomad in terms of residency. Right now, I'm in Asheville, North Carolina. I've lived here for almost the last year, here to finish a book specifically. Before that, I lived in Indian Rocks Beach, Florida, and I spent a fair amount of time in London, England, because I have a daughter and two grandsons there.
Ah, very nice. And now you said you worked in D.C. for the government. In what capacity?
Well, the first job I had with the government was in, when was that? 77, 78. I worked in the Carter administration. I worked in the White House. And what did you do for Carter? I worked in a division or an office called the Presidential Personnel Office, and that's the office that handles all the political appointments that are open to the administration. That's from cabinet-level jobs, secretaries of various agencies, right on down to Schedule C employees, which are are political appointees who serve at the pleasure of the president, and that's that covers several thousand people in total. And that office primarily did the research in the clearing process for those people, that personnel.
So you were involved in handing out these jobs?
Yes.
Oh, that must have been a juicy. That must have been a real. You must have had a lot of juice then, right?
No, I mean I was one of. That's quite a while ago. One of maybe about 40, 45 people that work in that office. It was an extremely interesting place to work. Prior to that, I'd never worked for the government at the federal level. Growing up in Vermont and after college, I had a fair amount of exposure to state government, but federal government is nothing like state government, especially when you're dealing with state government in Vermont, which is fairly unsophisticated compared to a lot of states. But it was a job I very much enjoyed. I mean, it was 7 days a week, usually on average 12, 13 hours a day, but time passed quickly there, and I think I enjoyed every minute of it.
And what was your impression of Jimmy Carter?
I liked Jimmy Carter an awful lot, Eve. When I was there in the 70s, and I still like him. I actually love the man. I think he's a very, extremely decent man, and I have a lot of respect for him. I think he got, in a lot of ways, he got a bad rap as president, but people forget. I think people are coming back around to realizing how good a president he was. I mean, we weren't at war any of the years that he was president. The economy wasn't great, but at this point, I think people understand the president really doesn't have that much sway in regards to the economy. It's a matter of luck mostly. But I have the utmost respect and affection for Jimmy Carter and his wife.
Yeah, I've always liked him as well. I like him a lot more now, I think, than I did at the time.
Yeah, he's done a lot with his life. I mean, he's does a tremendous amount of volunteer work, meaningful volunteer work. Travels the world in the interest of peace. Unlike, he hasn't gone out and started his own foundation and amassed millions, if not billions, of dollars. I think he's done the right thing with his post-presidency years.
Yeah, he doesn't seem to be part of that club of selfish ambition like the Bushes and the Clintons and even Obama. He seems to be like an outsider from that group.
I don't think he's not part of that clique at all. I think if anything, in a lot of ways, times started to change after Carter was president. One of the things that people would remark to me a lot when I was in D.C. is how much D.C., with each administration, how much that altered or changed the city in terms of economic stratums and thinking and politics. And at the time that I lived there, the city of D.C. was, in a lot of ways, really a mixed bag, both racially and economically. And now it's actually it's probably the most wealthy area in the country, and that's that's no coincidence. I think a lot of people have figured out how to use public service for self-aggrandizement and self-profit, and there's certainly a lot of good examples out there. Whereas in the 70s and prior to that, it just really wasn't considered or thought of that public service at any level, low level, or right up to the presidency, could also be parlayed into amassing a fortune. It just, that was foreign to thinking back then, but it's become pretty commonplace today.
Well, we're taping this show on November 9th, when the whole country's kind of woken up to like one of the most shocking events. What do you make of the election last night?
Well, I haven't woken up yet, because I ended up I watched the returns, and then thought it was interesting that Hillary Clinton had nothing to say last night, and waited until actually early this afternoon. But I could see that it became apparent that Trump was going to make a speech, so I stayed up for that, and I think that happened at, I don't know, 4:30. So after that, I just decided to do what I do most of the time, and write. But I don't find the election as any great surprise. I did not vote for Donald Trump only because I had some concerns. Not so much about his qualification, that didn't bother me, but I had some concerns about some of his attitudes initially towards women, towards minorities, towards the handicapped, with that one incident. But the outcome is really no surprise to me. I think it was apparent that they were misreading this election all along, and that they were misreading. They just didn't understand the level of frustration and anger and level of hurt that's all throughout the country. And I think, the reason he carried the Middle America, the Rust Belt, is a good example of that level of anger and frustration and hurt that's out there. But I voted for Hillary. I really had to force myself to do that. But I'm not a Clinton fan. Never have been. I've never been a fan of Bill Clinton, although I voted for him. And I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. I'm registered as an independent. But and I know a lot of people are really alarmed about Trump being the president-elect, but I honestly believe that I think he'll come around. I think he has a potential. He has a clean slate now. He has a completely clean slate in front of him going forward as president. Is there some baggage behind him? Yeah, but I think he's got the opportunity to really do something. He's got, the Republicans have control of both houses of Congress, and I think the potential there, theoretically, is that he could actually be a great president. And if you look at just some of the programs he's proposed, not immigration, but the two programs that interest me the most is what he's said. They're not really detailed about the inner cities, and then his policies on rebuilding America. I think those two facets alone could result in some tremendous impact on the country if he can get some programs and policies through Congress. And I don't see much reason why he can't. That sort of stalemate that's been in effect for the last 9 years shouldn't exist any longer. So I'm kind of optimistic about him, and I'm not one that plays a blame game or looks back and says, "Oh, if only this, if only that." So, I consider him my president, the president of the country, and hopefully he'll make good on his promises. If he doesn't, he won't be reelected.
Yeah, we can only hope and pray. We can only hope and pray that we survive this.
I don't think I don't share the worries that a lot of people do about, his proximity to the the red telephone or the nuclear button. I think he's a human like everybody else. He has children. He has grandchildren. He's not going to. I don't see him getting this. I don't see his temperament drawing us into any kind of nuclear war. So I don't see that as a big factor at all. I think he'll be humbled initially by just the office of the presidency. It's Washington D.C. can be a pretty imposing place, and I know Trump fancies himself as the maker of big deals, but I'm not sure he's ever made deals or negotiated things like they do at the DC level, or played the game the way they do there. So he'll learn a lot, and hopefully he'll catch on fairly quickly, because he is a deal maker, and a lot of presidents in the past haven't been, and that's been to their disadvantage. So I don't know. I'm gonna be optimistic about him until there's a reason not to be.
Yeah, that's true. There's no point in dwelling on the negative. Now this,
no, there isn't. The past is the past.
Now this book, a terrible mistake: the murder of Frank Olson and the CIA's secret Cold War experiments. It's published by Trying Day. Good old Chris Milligan, friend of the show, and
right.
Incredible reviews. You go on Amazon, 90% positive. The top reviews. Well researched.
Thank you.
Yeah. So tell us the story now. Who was Frank Olson, and what happened?
Well, in a lot of ways, I spent a long time on that book, just investigating the story about, I think, 7 years, and then 3.5, 4 years to actually write the book. It's a fairly large book. It's probably it's around 900 pages. It's probably a little bit longer than it should be. Although I go back to it a lot, and I actually find it helpful in some of my current research. I actually forget a lot of the subjects and side stories I did cover in that book. But Frank Olson, in a lot of ways, I mean, the book is about Frank Olson, about Frank Olson's life, about his work as a biochemist for Fort Detrick, which was the U.S. Army's chemical and biological center that, after the Second World War, contracted with the CIA secretly for the development of you name it, everything under the sun in terms of biological and chemical weapons. And Frank Olson was a civilian. He started off as a military employee of Fort Detrick, but then for his, I think, approximately last 4 or 5 years there was a civilian employee. And he was smack dab in the middle of the epicenter of activities that were being conducted there for the CIA. But in a lot of ways, I soon after, initially when I started researching Frank Olson, I did not have a book in mind. I was going to do what I thought would be maybe 7,000 to 10,000 word article, but I realized within 2 or 3 months, because of things that happened coincidentally, and then just digging deeply enough into the story and realizing that it far exceeded a 10,000 word article, I realized there was a book there. But I also realized that there was far more than just the story of Frank Olson. That if anything, and I don't mean this unkindly, Frank Olson was sort of a prop in terms of telling the bigger story. His story was extremely unfortunate. He allegedly committed suicide in New York City in November of 1953 by jumping out the window of a hotel. It's now called the Pennsylvania Hotel, but back then it was the Statler Hotel. And that was a story, because he was allegedly depressed. And from late 1953 until 1975, that was the story that primarily existed only in the heads of people that knew him, friends and neighbors, and nobody in the country knew about the incident or thought about the incident. And then in 1975, as a result of the exposure of a number of CIA abuses, the President Ford appointed the Rockefeller Commission to look into those abuses, and headed by Nelson Rockefeller, they issued their report after about a year, and for some odd reason, nobody's ever really been able to fully explain it, mentioned in the narrative of the report that a civilian employee of Fort Detrick had died in New York City in 1953 as a result of suicide, but then added the caveat that it occurred after he had been dosed with LSD by the CIA at a secret meeting in Deep Creek Lake, Maryland, about 9 days before he allegedly killed himself. And they didn't even provide Frank Olson's name. They just, I think it read specifically an unidentified or unnamed civilian employee. But that was enough information for savvy journalists out there to find Olson's name, I think, easily within 24 hours. And of course, Frank Olson's survivors, his family at that time, which was his wife and his three children, still lived in Frederick, Maryland, and they, of course, saw the report.
Welcome back to the quickest podcast ever, brought to you by Kohl's.
Today's topic, fall style.
Wait, wasn't it just June?
Right? So I went to Kohl's.
Of course you did.
I got a cute Cara Santana for 9 West sweater for 25% off and a great pair of Vans.
Love Vans.
And saved 25% on a Champion hoodie for my husband.
Ooh, sounds cozy.
You should go. You'll get 15% off or 15, 20, or even 30% off with a Kohl's card.
BRB.
Select styles. Offers end September 26th. Champion coupons do not apply. Some exclusions apply. See store or Kohl's.com for details.
Streaming only on Peacock.
John Wayne Gacy is suspected of having killed as many as 32.
Straight from the killer's mouth.
They want you to believe that I alone committed these murders.
The new gripping 6-part documentary series that investigates the crimes that shocked the nation.
The thing everybody thought they knew wasn't the whole story.
John Wayne Gacy, Devil in Disguise. All episodes streaming now. Devil in Disguise. Only on Peacock.
And put two and two together. They knew it had to be their father, because they knew their father had committed suicide by going through the window at the Statler Hotel in New York. But they knew nothing. Nobody knew anything about the LSD dosing, and that basically came as a shock to the family, to the overall media at the time, and to the American public, that the CIA would do anything like that. Again, keep in mind this was 1975, so it was pretty much right on the hot heels of the whole counterculture movement and in the popularity of psychedelic drugs. But that exposure had a really interesting effect on the overall attention that was made to Olson's death, and that was specifically that, okay, this guy, nobody really knew why he killed himself in 1953, but now we know why he killed himself because, 9 days before he'd been given LSD, and nobody really asked the appropriate questions that should have come right after that, such as, well, why was he given LSD? Why in God's name would the CIA dose a high-level scientist, biochemist that was working for them? What would provoke that kind of incident or activity? And the stories that came out within days of Olson's identification, again in 1975, is that Olson wasn't the only person that was dosed at Deep Creek Lake, Maryland. That there were several other scientists who were also dosed, and fortunately none of those men, they were all men, none of those men ended up killing themselves or seemed to have experienced anything bad, such as a bad trip. Although it's extremely unusual for a bad trip to last 9 days. Nobody raised that either. I mean, there were a lot of journalists that just drew the line and the conclusion, okay, this guy was given LSD, he had a bad trip for 9 days, and then he killed himself. And that, most scientists, even at that point in time, knew, that was just extremely unusual. And suicide as a result of taking LSD wasn't completely uncommon, but it was fairly rare. There were instances of, in the United States at approximately during the 60s and 70s, where people would fall into situations where they committed suicide. The classic stories like somebody being on the 4th or 5th floor of a building and thinking they could fly, and of course they couldn't, and the ground got in the way. But
yeah, I believe Art Linkletter's daughter was a famous case like that.
Yeah, that was actually the best known case, Art Linkletter's daughter.
Until you start looking into the circumstances around it, And then one of the guys that was with her was around a couple of other suicides as well.
Yeah, there were 3 or 4, and as time went on, a number of reporters stuck with the story for at least a year or two, some upwards of 3 years, and dug into it and pursued the government's use and the CIA's use and the Army's use of LSD, and eventually it was exposed that the Army had conducted extensive experiments with LSD at Edgewood Arsenal and also in Maryland, and as a result of those experiments, it was exposed that I think it was between 5,000 and 6,000 military enlisted men were dosed with LSD as part of ill-defined experiments, and there were 3 or 4 suicides among that group. Again, that's a fairly low number. 6,000 people dosed during about 18 months, and so 4 to 5 committed suicide. And again, it sort of underscored that suicide wasn't really a byproduct, a negative byproduct of LSD, but maybe the drug triggered various things
When they were dosing these soldiers and Frank Olson, were these like huge doses, like abnormally high doses, or were just regular doses?
Actually, the dose that Olson was given was considered fairly low. It was enough to provoke what's commonly referred to as a trip, but it wasn't enough to, in the opinion of a lot of scientists. Everybody reacts differently to the drug, but a lot of scientists didn't think it was enough to trigger an unpleasant or bad trip. With the Army experiments involving, approximately 6,000 service people, that was those experiments involved a fairly hefty dose. I think it was 125, 150 mics, and that's considered a really healthy dose. And you're sure to have a trip, have an experience with that much LSD. And in a lot of ways, it wasn't even clear at the time that the Army was doing the experiments what drug they were actually giving these men. It was, for the sake of convenience, called LSD, but there were a number of there were maybe 5 or 6 compounds that the CIA and the Army were working with that effect-wise all sort of fell under the umbrella of LSD, but were in some ways stronger drugs, and those are given numbers. I'm not there in the book, but very sort of unsexy generic names like product 19 but the common denominator they all had is they came from the same chemical company, same pharmaceutical company, and that was the Sandoz Chemical Company, and they were the initial provider. Actually, they were the only pharmaceutical company in the world that was producing LSD at that time. They had no idea. They knew the effects of the drug, but they had no idea what the use of the drug was. They sort of stumbled on it by mistake, and again understood the effects and thought the effects were very fascinating, but how to use the drug, a productive or a good use for it escaped everybody at Sandoz, and the Army and the CIA was initially interested in it, and this seems sort of far-fetched now for anybody that knows much about LSD, but the CIA and the Army were initially interested in the drug for interrogation purposes, and they thought, well, maybe it can be used as a truth drug, and we interrogate somebody, we dose them with LSD, and they'll spill the beans. They'll tell us everything that a subject wouldn't tell us under normal circumstances or in a common interrogation setting. But of course, as people know, they could have talked to anybody. Any young kid in San Francisco could have told them that at that point in time, but I guess it never occurred to anybody to talk to the counterculture on the street. But
let me ask you this real quick. Now, when they were dosing these people, these Army soldiers and this guy Frank Olson, were they dosing them with their knowledge and telling them, "Hey, we're about to give you a dose of something here; it's an experiment," or were they secretly slipping it into their food and stuff?
They were secretly dosing them. They were told what they were told, and it varied once in a while depending on the doctors involved. And actually, some of the doctors were were former German or Nazi physicians who had worked for the Nazis during the Second World War and then had been imported into the United States and the American military because of various skills they had, and 2 or 3 of them ended up at Edgewood Arsenal, involved in the LSD experiments. But what they told the several thousand soldiers was that they were experimenting with a relatively harmless drug, and that you probably will not experience any effects from it, but just try to pay attention and then report back to us as to what your reaction was. And in most cases, these people were given the drug and then told they were given in liquid form. And a lot of the men thought it was just simply a glass of water because there is no visible, there's no taste to LSD, and there's it looks like water, and it was water. It was just mixed in with the water. But after they consumed the drug, they were just told, okay, go on your merry way, go back to your MOS, carry out your job, and and that's not the wisest thing under the sun to do. Very few people under the influence of LSD can conduct themselves the way they normally would in a work situation, especially if it involved anything complex. And the Army actually made some films of some of these soldiers. Some were just there marching in formation, and that was a disaster. They were, the various commands were being called out, turn right, turn left, halt, attention, all that. And the group was just completely disoriented, had no idea what was going on. And remarkably, I dug into those experiments, and I found remarkably one of the groups that was dosed with LSD were about 12 soldiers that worked at a Nike missile base. And after they were dosed, they went back to the base to manning the missiles. And I don't think that was the wisest thing to do, but fortunately there was no fallout from it, or at least we're not told there was any fallout from it. And we're told there wasn't any fallout from it. But again, it wasn't a smart thing to do. But anyway, that the LSD experimentation and various other drugs, some the mescaline, peyote, various psychedelic mind-altering drugs were experimented with by the CIA from approximately 1951 until about, I think, 1961, 1962. And a tremendous amount of money was spent by the CIA and the Army in terms of that experimentation. The CIA let about 100 subcontracts out under the code name MK Ultra to various universities, hospitals, institutes across the country to conduct their own experiments. Most of that money went through some sort of front because a lot of those organizations wouldn't have taken money directly from the CIA, but some were knowledgeable, some were quite witting that the money was coming from the CIA, and they had no issue with it. Virtually every prestigious university and college across the country got some sort of contract from about 53 until 1960. I was in Vermont at the time. I grew up in Vermont, and the biggest university there is the University of Vermont. And they even had a 2-year contract with the CIA. They didn't realize it was the CIA. It went through some sort of foundation before it got to the university. But so anyway, the experimentation that made the experimentation even more widespread, and the various people that oversaw these experiments on various campuses or hospitals or institutes, would have to file monthly reports with the LSD. Some of those with the CIA. Some of those reports survived. It was, again, fairly remarkable at the looseness of how those experiments were conducted. Generally, at some of the bigger universities with no follow-up whatsoever. And in a few cases, as you can imagine, some students got into some real trouble mentally handling the drug. And a couple of the more outrageous examples occurred on a weekend when no doctor was available. And the student ended up checking into the local emergency room, and of course had no idea what drug they had been given, or if they even had been given a drug. Because again, in a lot of cases, these were unwitting experiments. So that went on for about 10 years. In retrospect, it looks extremely ludicrous, absurd that government agencies would be that irresponsible and conduct activities like that. But and so that was sort of part and parcel to, in just maybe 1/8 of the overall Olson story, part and parcel of the Olson narrative. And Olson was very much a part of that because, again, he was dosed at Deep Creek Lake, and when the CIA was pressed after 1976 as to why they dosed him and a few of the other scientists that were at this retreat, the response was, well, it was just for fun. It was a lark, and that it had happened a lot in various settings overseen by the CIA, where they would dose people just to have fun, to see what the result would be. And again, all these dosings were conducted on unwitting people, and when the person would start to feel strange, they would say, oh, you know what, you just took some LSD like 45 minutes ago, so if you feel odd, that's why you feel odd. But not really the funniest situation you could put somebody in at all. But in terms of the broader story with Olson, there were a lot of other compounds involved, a lot of biochemicals, some extremely lethal, and tied to the CIA's desire to have Fort Detrick create extremely toxic compounds that would be untraceable, that could be used for assassination purposes. And the Fort Detrick Olson's division, which was called the Special Operations Division, devoted a tremendous amount of time to attempting, in some cases, attempting to successfully produce biological agents like that. And that even went to the extreme, and this was documented in paper, it's covered in the book, where Fort Detrick scientists, SOD scientists at Fort Detrick, devised the means to induce cancer in targeted individuals, and that alone was pretty incredible. And I can only imagine that the sophistication of that means has only advanced over the years. It certainly hasn't been abandoned. And there's speculation about a lot of cases where that perhaps has been used. One of the most common ones, and I certainly don't know if it was used or not, it was Jack Ruby, as a result of the Kennedy assassination and Ruby's assassination of Oswald, and then his coming down with cancer fairly quickly and coinciding with his perhaps wanting to be a little more talkative about why he killed Oswald, but he was overtaken by cancer, and that could have been a coincidence, or it could have been deliberate. That he was given cancer, and there's numerous other cases like that. The Russians at the same time developed the same capacity, and it's probably a little better documented, or it may be propaganda. I don't know that the Russians have used that ability far more often than we have, but the thing people have to consider, and this applies to state-sponsored, U.S. government-sponsored assassination in any form, be it, throwing somebody off a building, a bridge, a hotel room, shooting them, giving them, some sort of exotic compounded drug. But in most cases, we the public, we're not going to be aware of that happening or when it happens, unless it's a very high level person that whose death would draw scrutiny right away. But the fact that Olson's death really underscores is that he was very, very low level. He was given LSD. As it turns out, he was targeted for other reasons by the CIA. But again, when he committed suicide in November 1953, there was a small article in the local Frederick paper, and that was it. And nobody asked any questions, and it's provocative in the sense that it really makes you wonder how often that occurred during that decade, in the 60s and the 70s, and right on up till today. Because again, we know that the government's gotten far more sophisticated in their abilities to kill people.
You mentioned
targeted individuals.
Yeah, well, you mentioned before the show that Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was part of these college experiments, correct?
Yeah, he was. He at Harvard. The exact details of the experiment he participated in still aren't known. But the fact that he did participate in experiments that were underwritten by the CIA at Harvard is there's no doubt about that. It's pretty well documented. And the psychologist, the physician that oversaw those experiments is actually an extremely well-known and respected psychologist. His name was Harry Murray. I think his actual name was Henry Murray. People called him Harry. I don't know why Harry was his nickname, but he's an extremely well-known, respected, he's dead today, but psychologist who wrote a lot of books and frankly wasn't known for experimenting or handling psychedelic drugs, but I guess the money was available, so and it was pretty easy money at that time, so a lot of people simply took it without much regard to the potential harm that they could do to subjects and individuals involved in the experiments. But yeah, Kaczynski was definitely a subject, and as expected, there's speculation. Well, maybe he was an extremely bright student. A lot of people considered him a genius, and then at some point, I don't think anybody really knows where he went off track, and so a lot of people have drawn connections between his participation in the LSD experiment and maybe his going off track mentally. I I'm suspicious of that. I'm not sure the LSD had that much to do with his becoming the Unabomber, but who knows?
Well, because in the book, though, you touch on other mind control programs besides just LSD, correct?
Right.
What other types of things were they doing?
Well, in terms of mind control, there was a real fervor in the early 50s, again through to about the mid 60s, to kind of capture the Holy Grail in terms of having the easy, quick ability to take control of somebody's mind. Again, it sprang from intentions to initially intentions to interrogate people, but then over a period of about 2 or 3 years, there was a lot of talk, and this is pretty well documented. This is very well documented in surviving records from the CIA and the Army that there was chatter about creating what's commonly called today the Manchurian candidate, and that being a person who could be mentally programmed to kill, and then further programmed to not remember the fact that they had killed, that they'd been programmed to murder, assassinate a specific subject, and then their memories would be wiped clean after that. A lot of that experimentation involved hypnosis, and that the whole hypnosis experiments, in a lot of ways, are tremendously overlooked. But the CIA, I think the Army did very little in terms of hypnosis, but the CIA spent a tremendous amount of money in launching a tremendous amount of experiments in terms of working with hypnosis, and they brought in, at that point in time, I think every well-known hypnotist. Most of these people were highly skilled in hypnotism, but they were also psychiatrists or psychologists by training, and all of those people were contracted by the CIA, either wittingly or unwittingly, to help them establish hopefully good uses of hypnosis, or uses tailored to their objectives. And the end result of all this experimentation with hypnosis ended up with sort of a split community, both within the CIA and with a number of these expert hypnosis experts that helped the CIA, and with two sides to the end result. One side saying there was some success, but generally you couldn't program people to act against ingrained principles and moral feelings and religious feelings too. But the other side clearly said, and this is pretty well documented, that there were a number of great successes, and that you were able to do that, and those people that accept that generally point towards Sirhan as a likely subject, hypnosis subject. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. I haven't studied that case closely at all. Other people have. They've done a pretty good job of it, but nobody's definitively established whether or not Sirhan was any kind of experimental subject, especially in regards to assassinating RFK. So but there are other instances, other examples, much lesser known, but the Bobby Cat.
Peacock fuels your true crime obsession with exclusive new originals like John Wayne Gacy, Devil in Disguise.
He said to me, clowns can get away with murder.
Dr. Death, the undoctored story.
This guy's dangerous.
And Epstein's shadow, Ghislaine Maxwell.
She inherited Jeffrey Epstein's secrets.
There was this whole other world going on.
Plus the most bingeable crime series, Buried in the Backyard and Snapped. And with the Dateline 24/7 channel that's always on.
Did you want her dead?
You can't not obsess. Sign up now at peacocktv.com.
The case is probably the highest profile case, but my own feelings are, I don't think there's much doubt that the agency did conclude that hypnosis was extremely effective and that they had a number of successful examples to base that belief on. I know on the minor level of just hypnotizing couriers for the CIA, they had a tremendous amount of success, and that was just fairly simply, hypnotizing couriers to carry, be it important documents or products or whatever, short distances or long distances, and not being aware of it, so that any concerns would visibly show it. Anybody, reveal themselves to anybody that stopped them and interfered with them. But that's a pretty simple example, and that was already established that hypnotism could produce those kind of effects. But my curiosity basically was directed at creating, an assassin. That was pretty exotic.
In your research, did you come across any trauma-based mind control, like sexual abuse of young children in order to create trauma? You're familiar with that, right?
Yeah, that's a very broad field now, and I have mixed feelings about that. There were, one of the things that greatly disturbed me is there were experiments, CIA-sponsored experiments conducted at various New York City hospitals on children. And all of the children involved, all of the experiments that I could document involved children who were wards of the state, and meaning generally they were, without parents, or they'd been taken away from parents, or their parents had died, and the state had full jurisdiction over them. And they were also considered, and this was in the 50s again, autistic. And it was subsequently later proven that a lot of these children weren't autistic at all. They were just emotionally damaged on one level or another, or simply because of the trauma they experienced through separation from their parents or families, exhibited manifestations of behavior that were considered very subnormal, but today are viewed as being very, very normal. There were, but anyway, the experiments that were conducted on those children, and they were overseen by a physician whose name was Loretta Bender, and she was a highly respected psychologist who worked for Sinai Hospital in New York City. But those experiments, again, they were very early in the 50s, involved LSD, but the LSD was also combined with shock therapy, electroshock therapy. And some of these children not only were given LSD maybe 10 or 12 times, but received electroshock therapy, and I put the therapy in quotation marks, upwards of 50 times in a given period of 4 or 5 months, and that's extreme. That can be extremely damaging. It is extremely damaging and very, very controversial, even though shock therapy is still used today, but not not on that extensive a level at all.
Now, this was done at Mount Sinai Hospital.
50 or 60 sessions. Yeah, that's
what year?
That's covered in the book too.
What year?
I'm not sure. I think it was the 50s, and it was probably I'd have to check. Maybe 56.
Amazing.
57.
Amazing.
So I also, myself and a psychologist in San Francisco, Dr. Jeff Kaye, Kaye, wrote a fairly extensive article on it that can be found on the Truth Out site. And it's been republished hundreds of times. But that gives the actual numbers, the names of some of the children, the names of some of the other doctors, and very, very details about the experiments. It's really interesting. I can't think of the main man's name right now, but there was one child, and I think he's the only child that has been identified as an adult since those experiments took place. And I can't think of his name right now, but he's actually a well-known attorney in San Francisco.
Let me ask you a question, Hank, because we're coming up to the break, right? Can you give me like another half hour?
Sure.
Okay, great.
How long have we been talking already?
We've been talking an hour, and I didn't even take a commercial break because I'm like riveted to what you're saying. I didn't
realize it was that long.
No, this is really, really good stuff, and I really appreciate it. So let's take a commercial break.
Sure, I can do another half hour. Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you very much. We're with Hank Albarelli. This book we're talking about is A Terrible Mistake: The Murder of Frank Olson and the CIA's Secret Cold War Experiments. And he's got another book, too, that's a big hit. It's A Secret Order, Investigating the High Strangeness and Synchronicity in the JFK Assassination. So hopefully we can get to that, or we'll have Hank back. But we'll be right back after these messages with more of H.P. Albarelli. And now a word from our sponsors. Did you know that 30% of all people on online dating websites and personal ads are either married or in a monogamous relationship? 30%. If you suspect that your husband, your wife, your boyfriend, your girlfriend may be cheating online, go to emailrevealer.com and our online infidelity investigation. You give us their email address, and we can trace it back to online personal ads, dating sites, and social networks. We can even expand the investigation and find them cheating on escort service sites or even porn sites if they're registered to porn sites and swinger sites. So check out emailrevealer.com if you suspect your spouse is cheating, and check out our online infidelity investigation. William Ramsey is a producer here at the Opperman Report, and he's just come out with a new book, Children of the Beast, Aleister Crowley's Shadow Over Humanity. Now, he just sent me a copy of this book. Oh, boy, it's about 2 inches thick. And there's a chapter on just about everybody in this book that you can imagine. The Beatles, and Jack Parsons. Everybody's in here. It's incredible. And I definitely recommend this book. There's a bunch of pictures in here, too, of all these people and different chapters and information. Anselm LaVey and people I've never heard of, too. There's a whole bunch in here. JFC Fuller. I don't know who he is. But it's great stuff by our producer here, William Ramsey. So check out Children of the Beast, Aleister Crowley's Shadow Over Humanity. You can find it on Amazon.com. Or you could find it in the OppermanReport.com bookstore. We have an urgent bulletin. It seems that the group Strawman is still on the loose. It has been confirmed that Strawman are Canadian, okay, and that authorities are asking people to stay indoors, lock your doors and windows, until this group can be dealt with. You could find more information about this group of Canadians, at strawmanmusic.com. You can have your ad played here. Okay, we're looking for sponsors. Okay, in fact, we desperately need sponsors right now to take this show to the next level. So you can have your ad played here, read live, like I'm doing now, so artfully. Or we can even work up a little jingle for you with some music and stuff like that and play it here. You have no idea how inexpensive it would be to have your ad played on the Opperman Report on 7 stations live Friday night and another 7 stations live on Saturday night, plus replayed every day of the week on different stations, and then archived on YouTube, Spreaker, iHeartRadio, iTunes, and all different kinds of podcasts, Pod this and Podbean, all different kinds of places who archive the show for us. And on those archives, your ad would play indefinitely, forever. You also get a little banner on OppermanReport.com. You get a mention on the air, you get a little interview on the air, and all kinds of fun stuff if you sponsor Opperman Report. We have an opportunity to get this show on a major AM/FM station in California. We've been approved. So if you want to sponsor us into that, so incredibly inexpensive that your ad would be heard by the range covers 5 million people in population where your ad would be broadcast, and all these other stations would be thrown in for free. So really affordable prices to sponsor OppermanReport.com. Get a copy of my book, How to Become a Successful Private Investigator. You can get a copy of that book at emailrevealer.com, or you can get a copy of that book now. It's back up on Amazon.com. How to Become a Successful Private Investigator by Ed Opperman. And this book has been updated a little bit from the previous book that we had that was available to our wonderful listeners. Welcome back to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman, and we're here with H.P. Albarelli, Hank Albarelli. Is the author of, we're discussing mostly his book here about Frank Olson, A Terrible Mistake, the murder of Frank Olson and the CIA's secret Cold War experiment. So Hank, you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Now,
I'm here.
You also mentioned, too, that there's a connection to the mafia in this?
With the Cold War experiments?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. Well, there were a couple connections, and they're fairly convoluted. But the initial connection actually was sort of an extension of the initial connections that were established with the mafia at the beginning of the Second World War, and that I think was known as Operation Underground, and it involved Lucky Luciano and the infamous Meyer Lansky, and that incident, in a nutshell, was basically Luciano was an extremely notorious criminal at that time, and he was in prison, in federal prison in Dannemora prison in northern New York, and at the beginning, at the early part of the Second World War, when the invasion of Italy and Sicily was being planned, somebody came up with the suggestion, the idea that Luciano be released from prison and act to assist in that invasion, although his ties to Italy and Sicily were not that strong. But and that actually occurred, and that sort of opened the door in many ways for and this was done under the auspices of the OSS, which the Office of Strategic Services, which was the precursor to the CIA, run by General Bill Donovan. And Luciano and Lansky, as a result of that activity, developed a pretty strong tie to a number of people in the government. And that tie extended through the 50s, primarily because the OSS was gone at that point in time, the CIA had come along, but there was another federal agency called the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which is today it's called the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency. But that federal agency, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, had a couple of subcontracts with the CIA, also, ironically, to experiment with LSD and other drugs. This was in the 50s, and the primary mover and shaker with those experiments was a narcotics agent who was named George Hunter White, and he initially had a safe house in Greenwich Village in New York City, where he conducted numerous experiments with LSD on underworld figures, mainly because he had close ties to the underworld, and a lot of these people were mafia figures. And then that safe house, incredibly, was tied to the Olson story because that safe house opened in late 1952, and then Olson killed himself in 1953, and the CIA said, well, things are getting a little too hot in New York City regarding LSD. We don't want exposure on this, so they moved George White and the safe house to the San Francisco area, and eventually White was operating 2 or 3 safe houses in San Francisco, and also on a much lesser level targeting underworld figures and other people for LSD experiments there. But the bigger tie to the mafia and the CIA came in the early 1960s after Castro had taken over Cuba and been targeted by the CIA for assassination. And there were a number of sit-downs that occurred in Miami, Florida, between various high-level CIA officials, Sheffield Edwards being the primary person, and he was the director of the CIA's Office of Security at that point in time, and other CIA officials. And they met in Miami, I think it was at the Hotel Doral or the Fontainebleau, with a number of high-level mafia figures, the primary one being, I think it was Santo Trafficante, who was probably at that time, I don't think there was any probably about it, was one of the biggest heroin traffickers in the world. But what they wanted Trafficante to do was to use his various connections in Cuba, and he had extensive connections in Cuba because prior to Castro's takeover, he had owned 2 or 3 hotels and gambling casinos there. But to use his connections to target Castro and Fidel's brother, Raul, and Che Guevara for assassination, and also possibly for embarrassment through dosing with LSD, and they were actually given LSD to pass on to others in Cuba. To everyone's knowledge, that was not successful. I think it wasn't successful primarily because Trafficante didn't mind taking the money from the CIA. I think he was paid between $50,000 and $75,000, which is a large chunk of money in the early '60s. But he had no intent of targeting Castro for death or embarrassment or dosing with LSD, and primarily was still looking out for his own interests on the island of Cuba, because he was hopeful that he could get a lot of his holdings back. That never worked out, but at that point in time, he was negotiating with Castro to try to get his real estate back, and I think he'd left something like $30 million actually buried in Cuba, and he wanted the means to try to get that back also. Whether or not he got that money back, I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. But and I think there were other lesser known connections between the CIA and the mafia. I know with the QJ Win program, which was specifically an assassination program. It was both the code name for several individuals who were assassins, but it was also the code name for a larger assassination program. There were a number of mafia figures, American mafia figures, who had various numbered code names under QJ Win that were actually employed by the CIA for assassinations. Those were low-level assassinations, and what specifically they were, we'll probably never know. And it also involved figures, mafia figures, and Corsican Brotherhood figures in other parts of the world, in Western and Eastern Europe and Corsica, employing mafioso or mafia-connected people, again, for what the agency called wet jobs, meaning killing or assassination. And so the relationship between the mafia and the CIA was fairly extensive, and just illustrated through the little we know. And that association, even though the mafia is sort of fallen into disfavor because of the rise of all these other criminal cabals and syndicates, has continued. And the good evidence of that is the work that Gary Webb did, the reporter in San Diego, who was able to well document that there was a tremendous, this was during the 80s, I guess, or the 90s, there was a tremendous amount of heroin trafficking going on with criminal elements in Honduras, in Nicaragua, and other Latin American countries, with their mafia-type cabals, and between them and the CIA. And the payoff generally was, well, we meaning the CIA, would look the other way in terms of the drug trafficking in return for services rendered by these criminal elements, and it actually showed up in a number of congressional reports where the CIA admitted to various senators and congresspeople that sometimes it was necessary to, quote, deal with unsavory characters in order to unquote, in order to achieve their aims or objectives. And the agency was pretty blunt about that. And those dealings have extended, to the present, basically in every area in the world with various criminal groups or syndicates in the Middle East with drug traffickers, in Latin America, South America with drug traffickers. Generally, it's drug traffickers, but fairly often it's arms dealers also. And arms dealing is a subject that's often overlooked, but arms dealing in two biggest businesses in the world, both licit and illicit, are drugs and arms. And the CIA, is constantly arming one group or another, be it, Syria or Iraq or Iran or wherever, with arms. And the arms have to come from somewhere, and they can't leave a clear trail, say, to the doorstep of Ruger or Winchester or whatever, and so they have to deal with arms traffickers, and
so
those are pretty unsavory people.
In your research, did you run across Adnan Khashoggi?
Oh yeah,
okay.
Yeah, his name comes up pretty often, quite often. But and he was a favorite, and he was, I think, at one time he was the biggest arms dealer in the world.
Yeah.
And there were also, I can't think of the names right now, there were also a couple of Russian, and this is fairly recently, a couple of Russian arms traffickers who actually got tripped up or cost somebody at the CIA and now are in American prisons. But there's no shortage of arms traffickers out there. There's quite a number of them, and it's a very, very lucrative business. There's activities going on all the time, especially now in Africa, which is considered by both the CIA, the continent of Africa, both the CIA and the U.S. Army as sort of being the new frontier in terms of exploitation and military and covert activities, and because of the extensive natural resources that are constantly being discovered there. And people generally, the American public is completely out of touch or unknowledgeable about the extensive activities that are occurring in Africa. I fortunately have a couple of friends who live in Africa. I don't want to name the countries, but who are reporters, investigative journalists, and they're constantly pursuing stories over there. But some of the stuff that I've heard over the last 4 or 5 years is just unbelievable in terms of the CIA's activities in Africa. There are a number of black sites in various African countries where people have been taken from the Middle East, none of who had ended up in Guantanamo. Most of these people basically were drawn to a black site and then conveniently disappeared. But a lot of this interrogation, extensive enhanced interrogation that goes on, takes place in African countries because nobody pays attention. Nobody has a clue what's going on, or what the extent of those activities are, and they're pretty extensive.
Let me ask you a question, because more and more I'm being exposed to all this stuff, and it's a frightening world out there. It's these people have no
extremely.
These people have no hesitation to use really extreme torture and kidnapping and murders. In your personal work, now you're exposing all this stuff in your personal work. How much of a blowback have you personally experienced?
Well, not a whole lot. With the Olson book, I'm sorry. I got some maybe about halfway into it when it became fairly well known that I was researching the book. It was unavoidable because of some of the archives and documents I was trying to pursue, both through FOIA and other means that I was investigating the Olson, what turned out to be the Olson murder, the CIA became pretty knowledgeable about what I was doing. Eventually, they actually reviewed the book. I think the reviews on their website, and they didn't give it a great review. They said most of the information was
Streaming only on Peacock.
John Wayne Gacy is suspected of having killed as many as 32.
Straight from the killer's mouth.
They want you to believe that I alone committed these murders.
The new gripping 6-part documentary series that investigates the crimes that shocked the nation.
The thing everybody thought they knew wasn't the whole story.
John Wayne Gacy, Devil in Disguise. All episodes streaming now. Only on Peacock.
Fall is the season of gathering that brings us together with warmth and color. So whether it's a birthday, anniversary, or a special event, celebrate your friends and family with a gorgeous bouquet of roses from 1-800-Flowers.com. 1-800-Flowers makes it easy to brighten someone's day with 24 multicolored roses for just $39.99. To get 24 multicolored roses for just $39.99, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/tune-in. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/tune-in.
commonly known, which couldn't have been any more untrue. But I had a couple of incidents regarding the CIA where I was basically warned off from the story, and it didn't. I was onto the story. I wasn't going to let it go. I was told a couple times subtly that they thought I was a good American and that I had the level of intelligence and experience where I should be aware of the fact that maybe what I was pursuing could be harmful to the national interest. And I said, I really don't feel that way. It's, what I'm engaged in is basically history, a pursuit of history, and I'm not pointing the finger at any current activities, although it's pretty easy to read between the lines in terms of what I was doing. But and I had a couple of meetings that resulted in meetings with a couple of attorneys from the CIA. And initially, they said they were going to be helpful in regards to some of the questions I had, but they weren't helpful at all. If anything, they were. It was just an exercise in pumping me for information. Now, a lot of the reason this was going on at the time, and this is amply detailed in the book, is the Olson family were pursuing a lawsuit, a wrongful death lawsuit against the CIA, a $50 million lawsuit, putting the blame for Frank Olson's death squarely on the shoulders of the CIA. And the CIA was extremely concerned about that lawsuit advancing to the stage where maybe discovery, the process of discovery and the taking of depositions could occur. And some of the principals at that point in time were actually principals in the mind control programs were still alive, primarily Sidney Gottlieb, who oversaw MK Ultra, and a couple of the lesser known officials who had been involved in the Frank Olson case, who had actually been with Frank Olson in New York City when he killed himself. All of those people are dead now. I was actually able to interview Sidney Gottlieb by telephone. I was in the process of going to see him, but he died. He didn't die suspiciously. I mean, he was fairly elderly when I interviewed him, but I interviewed him by phone twice and extensively, and lo and behold, I actually found him to be fairly helpful. I think there was some real guilt there. There were some subjects, again, because of another lawsuit, similar to the Olson lawsuit that was going on against Gottlieb for another dosing involving an artist in New York City who had been in France in the 50s, who this artist claimed that Gottlieb had dosed him. So there were boundaries on all these interviews, but still, the information I was able to obtain was very helpful. There were other people who were alive. There was a doctor whose last name was Pelican. I think it was Edward Pelican, who was a very high-level toxicologist with, I think it was either Boston University or Boston College. Very, very well respected, and just through a stroke of luck, I was able to find out that he also was in New York City, directly involved with Frank Olson 2 or 3 days before his death, and I was able to find him. He's dead now. I was able to find him. It was pretty easy to find him once I knew what his name was in the Boston suburbs, but I couldn't get him. He wouldn't answer anything. Subsequent to that, though, he was deposed in another lawsuit involving the experiments that I talked about earlier at Edgewood Arsenal. There's a law firm in San Francisco that's suing the Army and the CIA for those experiments. And I gave them Pelican's name. I said, here's a guy that I've tried to talk to that, won't talk, but if you could possibly subpoena him and depose him, you might be able to get a hell of a lot of information, because he was working directly for the CIA at that time. He was actually a CIA employee. And they were able to subpoena him, and they brought him into a deposition, and he showed up with 2 CIA attorneys and took the Fifth Amendment, I think, 84 times. And the only question he would answer was what his name was and what his address was. And of course, those facts were in the phone book, and would answer nothing else whatsoever. And then he died 6 months later. He was also elderly, but when I talked to him, he seemed to be in pretty good shape. But so I always wondered about his death. But to answer your question maybe a little more directly, I really don't get concerned. People ask me that a lot, and I really don't get concerned about that. I don't. Maybe I'm naive, but I don't. I think it would be extremely stupid on any government agency's part to try to do physical harm to me. I'm sure they could sick the IRS on me the way they do a lot of people, but I don't have that kind of money. My taxes are pretty simple.
But how about the death of
Gary?
Gary?
I don't know how they could.
What do you make of the death
How
of
about
Gary?
what?
The death of Gary Webb. What do you make of that?
Well, Gary Webb was on. His case was a little different from me because he was onto something that was very, very timely at the time, and it involved numerous people that were alive, and he also had initially, a lot of community people were behind him, including, I think, 1 or 2 members of Congress. So what Webb did, I think, was extremely embarrassing to the CIA. Whether or not, I don't think they directly had a hand in killing him, but you don't have to have a direct hand in killing somebody. You can make things so miserable that for a targeted individual that you can, ensure the fact that they're going to kill themselves. And I think that's what happened to Gary Webb. And of course, the way they caused that outcome is they attacked they went after everybody around him. They went after all his employers. Unfortunately, the newspapers he wrote for didn't stand up for him at all. And they basically cut him off at the knees, or cut him off at the waist, actually, and he was out there all alone. He destroyed his family, and a lot of people, it's hard to live under those circumstances, and the easy and quick way out is suicide, and I think that's what they wanted, and that's what they got. Eventually, things would have come back for him. I think I'd like to think, things would have come back for him. That his employers would have been a little more respectful and considerate about what he had written. There was really no challenging as to what he'd written. His story was solid. But I think the pressure, I don't think anybody's aware of the amount of pressure, certainly not myself, the amount of pressure the government was able to exert on people around him. And of course, he had no work. He'd been let go from all his good job, and they destroyed all his sources. And I don't remember, he was working for some podunk paper when he died, if he was working at all. But that happens. That happens, and I guess that's a risk you take, especially if you're dealing with something that's very timely. I know, as I mentioned before, a couple of people I know in Africa who are pursuing stories, very hot stories, very, very timely stories, are always worried about that because they're extremely mindful of the fact they're in Africa, and people die all the time in Africa from all kinds of means, and I know the two people I deal with, that's constantly on their minds, and they're always sort of wondering about that aloud, or when we're communicating by phone or email or whatever, but. It's just something that comes with the territory. What can you do? You either do what you do, or you don't. Maybe it'll get better. It's certainly, in my experience, I was hopeful when Obama was elected. I thought things were going to become very transparent. Although when I was working on the Olson book, I had tremendous luck. The CIA was actually very responsive to everything I asked for, and I really didn't have to fight them for anything. But since Obama's been elected, I'm getting nothing. I mean, I've got active FOIA requests that have been in front of somebody with the agency for 3 or 4 years. And with an acknowledging letter that, okay, we'll get to this when we get to it, but that's it. And again, when I was working on the Olson book, they were responsive. I don't think anybody's getting anything anymore, and I think that's just the administration. I'm hoping that maybe under Trump, it'll change. I have no idea. It may take him years to even get to that. I don't even know if he knows what FOIA stands for, but I'd like to see it change somehow. But right now, freedom of information is basically a joke. Nobody gets anything.
Let me ask you a question,
and you have to sue.
Yeah.
You have to sue and that involves money.
I do want to touch on your other book, one of your other books, A Secret Order, investigating the high strangeness and synchronicity in the JFK assassination. What can you tell us about that book?
Well, that book basically, when I was working on the Olson book, it crossed. That book, the Olson book, crossed paths with the Kennedy assassination a lot. One of the central characters in the Olson book was a man who worked with the federal narcotics agent whose name was George Hunter White, and this man's name was his alias. The alias went by two aliases, Pierre Lafitte or Jean Martin. And when I was working on the Olson book, I found that under the name Jean Martin, this guy actually worked at the coffee company in New Orleans that Oswald worked at the very same time, but only for 2 or 3 months. And then he remained in New Orleans and opened a very well-known restaurant. I can't think of the name of it right now, but it's very well-known. And when he had worked with George Hunter White in New York City in '53, he also owned a couple of restaurants in the Village in New York. He was considered a master chef, but he was also a master imposter and con man and everything else. And I was just fascinated by the fact, and it was easy to verify, that he worked for the very same company that Oswald worked for shortly, in the coffee company in New Orleans. And I knew there was something to that, but although at that point in time, a number of other writers I knew were warning me constantly, stay away from the Kennedy assassination. It's a black hole, and if you fall into it, you never get out of it. And so I heeded that warning, but eventually I realized, okay, my curiosity is just going to get the best of me, and so I dove in head first, and I wrote the book, The Secret Order. All I did was take, I think it was 9 or 10 aspects of the assassination that I thought were extremely provocative and sort of fell into the category of coincidence, and also were very strange and unresolved, even standing on their own, apart from the assassination. And I wrote those up. It took a couple of years to do that book, which was fairly quick. And one of the chapters, the one I was most pleased with, actually was was about a woman who worked as a contractor for the CIA in Cuba after Castro had taken over, and then in Mexico City at the very same time that Oswald showed up in Mexico City. And her name was Viola June Cobb, commonly known as June Cobb. And I devoted a chapter to her in the book, but I hadn't found her before the book came out. I had been aggressively looking for her, but just kept hitting a brick wall. I thought perhaps she was dead, but there was no obituary anywhere. I went to New York. I went to Texas. I just wasn't able to find her. And then, about 6, 7 months after the book came out, I was lucky and I found her. I found her in a nursing home outside of New York, and that was maybe 5 years ago. But I was able to get a message to her. It was on, I think it was a Saturday or Sunday, and 2 hours after I asked a certain person to pass a message on to her, she called me up. And this, lovely older woman said, out of the blue, she said, I understand you're looking for me. And I said, is this June? And she said, yes. And I said, yes, I am looking for you, and I'd very much like to interview you. But the delightful thing that happened as a result of that contact is, again, it was about 5 years ago, is I became very close to her, strictly through the phone. And actually, for 2.5 years, ended up talking to her every single day, because she had no one in her life. She was confined to a nursing home, was not very healthy, probably hadn't been outdoors for, I think when I initially talked to her, for at least a year and a half. But again, was able to become close friends with her, and subsequently was able to get a lot of information. She became very close to my family. She had really no family of her own other than a nephew who also had problems. But and long story short, she actually became godmother to my first grandchild because she just loved hearing about him for so much. She died about a year and a half ago. Unfortunately, when I was out of the country, I told her I was going to be gone for a week and a half, but then I'd get in touch with her, and for whatever reason, and her health was failing terribly at that point in time, but she passed away. But for those 2.5 years, I got an extreme amount of information on what went on in Cuba. And this is from a person who actually worked for Fidel Castro, worked in the same building for him. Fidel Castro is he's the one that brought her to Cuba from New York City. He met her when he made his infamous visit to the UN there. And then when things got a little too hot for her in Cuba, she transferred to Mexico City, and it was in Mexico City when Oswald went through, and I can't say a lot, but actually encountered Oswald in Mexico City. Actually was in the same room with him, and there's a really fascinating story there. And I've been working on a book related to Oswald in Mexico City with June Cobb as a central character, because everything I learned or unlearned about Mexico City came from her, and it was just an utterly fascinating experience in listening process.
Well, let me ask you this:
to talk to somebody who was there,
because a lot of people think that the Oswald that was in Mexico City is not the same Oswald.
No, it was the same Oswald. There's, in my view, there's no doubt about it whatsoever. I mean, I spent, even before encountering June, I spent a lot of time looking into that. And there's a lot of confusion about Mexico City and Oswald, but I don't think there's any doubt. There's no doubt whatsoever in my mind that Oswald was in Mexico City. And the story, as I've been able to put it together, it actually makes perfect sense as to why he was there. And why he was there wasn't too far from the story he was, the reasons he was saying he was there. Sometimes people read too much into a situation and ignore, what's actually going on. But and it's more involved than that. But I just can't give a lot away at this point in time. I hope to finish that book. I don't know, within 6 or 8 months. There's another book that sort of bumped that one back a little bit. Another book concerning the assassination that I'm working on now that should be done in December, late December.
Are you familiar with
Are you
familiar with a report that says that probably the CIA or the FBI had heard recordings of Oswald talking in the Soviet embassy in Mexico, and they said, well, that's not his voice. Did it come up in your research that they had these recordings of inside the Soviet embassy?
No, I did speak to one CIA official who worked in the American embassy in Mexico City, who had made that claim. Okay. But when I interviewed him, he retracted it. He wasn't sure. He's also, the problem with a lot of these stories now, everybody's elderly, and it's either confused by time or just old age. But this same individual who I interviewed claimed he had actually seen photos of Oswald in Mexico City. And when I talked to him, he stuck to that. He was absolutely convinced that he had seen 2 photos of Oswald coming out of the Russian embassy. Not going in, but coming out. And he said he'd stake his life on it. So I don't know. But again, I don't have any doubt that Oswald was there. A lot of the reason I have no doubt is because of my discussions with June Cobb, and her revealing a lot of things that were going on at that point in time. And in a lot of ways, in a lot of ways, Mexico City was really a snake pit in September and October 1963. There were all kinds of intrigue going on, and people playing both sides against the middle. And Win Scott wasn't exactly the quintessential loyal CIA station chief, and he had a lot of problems of his own, and he was very close to a number of people that briefly entertained Oswald when he was in Mexico City. So there was, I guess what I'm trying to say is there was a lot of reason for Scott and other people to cover up a lot of the facts that occurred at the time that Oswald was there. It wasn't that convoluted. It was, to me, it was a pretty cut and dry story. And then there's the whole, and that second book deals with it, the whole Elena Guerrero story. She and her daughter went to a party in Mexico City at the same time that Oswald was there. It was a twist party when, that was the time when Chubby Checker and the twist was really big. And Oswald was there at the party with 2 other individuals, 2 other Americans. And she, she staked, both she and her daughter staked their lives on it, that they met Oswald there, and they actually briefly communicated with him at that party. And they knew after the fact who Oswald was. At that point in time, they had no idea who he was. But they were, Elena Guerrero was an extremely intelligent woman, extremely bright, internationally known writer. And for me, there was no doubt that, she knew who she had met. And I was able to identify one of the people that was with Oswald at that party. So after that was accomplished, it made perfect sense as to why Oswald was there and what was going on in Mexico City and New Orleans. So,
what other kind of strangeness and synchronicity can you tell us about that's in this book? Well,
the other story I'm extremely fond of in the book, and it's unresolved. I don't know if it'll ever be resolved. Is connected to the MK Ultra in artichoke programs, the drug programs, and it concerned a man called Demi Dimitrov, who was from Eastern Europe and had been brought by the CIA to Panama and for interrogation because they thought perhaps he was a double agent. He wasn't. But he was given what they called the artichoke treatment, which went on for about 1.5 years, which was electroshock therapy, numerous dosings with LSD, morphine, you name it. And then when they realized, okay, we've made a mistake with this guy, they cut him loose, and he didn't want to go back to Eastern Europe. He said, I'd like to go to the United States. So I think they gave him a check for $350 and kissed him goodbye. But he was a pretty fascinating subject in the stories in the book, but he ended up, he had a lot of contacts, and he ended up being sort of involved on the fringe with the Kennedy assassination, and claimed that he knew who killed Kennedy and why, and actually allegedly had a sit-down meeting with the President of the United States and revealed that. I think it was with Ford. But the thing, and this is where it gets really crazy, he was, through another journalist, a foreign journalist, was asked to go to London and meet with him and reveal what he knew. He went to London, got off the plane, walked into the airport, and disappeared. And he's never been seen again. He's just gone.
Really?
And that story's in the book. And fortunately, and this happens a lot with books, I've been told, and a few times with me, he had a daughter. I was unable to find her, but about 5 or 6 months after the book came out, I got a call.
Peacock fuels your true crime obsession with exclusive new originals. John Wayne Gacy, Devil in Disguise.
Clowns can get away with murder.
And Epstein's shadow, Ghislaine Maxwell.
She inherited Jeffrey Epstein's secrets.
Plus the most bingeable crime series, Snapped. Sign up now at peacocktv.com.
From his daughter. It just happened that I was living in Florida then, and she was only about 60 miles away, living also in Florida from where I was. And so, I talked to her extensively, and then went to see her. I need to go see her, again, but, to glean what she learned from her mother. She was very young when her father disappeared, but she was also very thankful. She had no idea what had gone on with her father, and was very thankful that, she got central pieces of the story. But she also had some interesting things to pass on that she had learned from her mother. And so, that was very, very lucky. How I'm going to use that, I'm not really sure, because it really doesn't connect up to Mexico City or directly to the assassination. I am convinced that Dimitrov definitely did know who killed Kennedy and why. I don't have much doubt about that.
And what was his theory?
And I think the thing that underscores that is that he vanished.
And what was his theory? Who did he think killed Kennedy and why?
Well, nobody was ever able to get that information from him. That's he was brought to London to meet with this investigator who was fairly notorious, who dealt with Jack Ruby a lot too, and there were reasons to be suspicious about him. But again, Dimitrov just disappeared. A lot of people think he was killed, but who knows? Certainly he's dead now. I mean, that happened 35 years ago, and he wasn't that young at that point in time. So,
have you come to a conclusion why you think Kennedy was murdered and who did it?
Yes.
Can you share that with us?
I have. I can't. No, I can't. I will when the book comes out in February. But yes, I have come to the conclusion. Yeah. Yeah, and it's based on what I consider to be some pretty solid evidence.
Okay. So, and is there anything, because we're down to the last couple of minutes, is there anything in this book that you can share with us, The Secret Order Investigating the High Strangeness and Synchronicity, that you think is...
Well, no, the June Cobb story, the Dimitrov story, the Adele Edison story, which is very, very provocative, and again, unexplained. There's a lot of aspects to it that just make no sense whatsoever. There's a chapter on Oswald when he was 12 and 13 when he lived in New York City. And I think a lot of the things that happened in New York City were, maybe they were coincidental. I don't know. I really don't know.
Okay, well, give me an idea real quick. What happened in New York City? I never even knew he lived in New York City. What can you tell us?
Yeah, he and his mother took him to New York City, where his half brother lived. His half brother was in the Navy, and they lived in New York City for I think approximately a year. His mother got a job. Oswald was put in public school, some number. Was truant very frequently. Skipped school all the time. Would ride the subway all over New York City. Was very fond of going to the New York City Zoo, which was another incredible coincidence because there's a building close by to where Oswald would go all the time called Morgan Hall. And it houses, I don't know which animals. But at that very same time, the federal narcotics agent I earlier told you about, George Hunter White, the alias he used in 1953, same year Oswald was there, was Morgan Hall. So, maybe that's a coincidence. I don't know. If it's a coincidence, it's a hell of a coincidence. And there are a lot of little things like that. Jobs. His mother had a couple jobs in New York City, and they actually, those jobs that were connected with George Hunter White's wife's jobs. She actually, they at one point in time worked for the very same employer at different times, not together. And, that was a pretty extreme coincidence, but, life is strange. It's, I don't know, when you look into things really, really deeply, at least with me, it's not uncommon to have these really strange coincidences come up. And I've talked to other writers about this. You also, the thing that's inescapable, you get this feeling, and it's very hard to describe, but you get this feeling that virtually everything is connected for very good reasons. And sometimes the feeling is overwhelming. Some writers refer to it as a research angel that visits you and exposes these things or gives you hints of certain things. But I guess you got to be really obsessive about the research you do. But I am fairly obsessive about research. I'm never satisfied with anything. I mean, I could spend 2 or 3 weeks just pursuing really simple stuff.
Yeah, I always say it's a small world. It's a small world, and everything is connected.
It is a small world, yeah.
But Hank, we're out of time.
Yeah, definitely.
Hank,
okay.
Albarelli, thank you so much. As soon as this next book comes out, hit me up, and I'd love to interview about that as well. Okay?
Yeah, I'll let you know, and I can get a copy to you. And yeah, it'll be a real game changer. I can guarantee you that.
Thank you so much. So I'll contact you on Facebook about that.
It'd be fun to talk to you about it.
Thank you very much.
Okay, take care.
Hank Albarelli, A Terrible Mistake, The Murder of Frank Olson, and the CIA's Secret Cold War Experiments. And also, too, don't forget this other book, A Secret Order. Come on. Did I just do that? Okay. A Secret Order Investigating the High Strangeness and Synchronicity in the JFK Assassination. Now, if you enjoyed the show, remember, there's a lot more in the member section. You go to OppermanReport.com, you become a member. There's additional content, additional shows that don't play on here. There's videos, there's documents, court documents, all kinds of interesting stuff there at OppermanReport.com in the members section. Thank you so much.
Fall is the most birthday-packed season of the year, so chances are you have a few celebrations coming up. Make sure your friends and family feel special with a gorgeous bouquet of roses from 1-800-Flowers.com. 1-800-Flowers makes it easy to send the perfect gift. 24 multicolored roses for just $39.99. To get 24 multicolored roses for just $39.99, Visit 1-800-Flowers.com/tune in. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/tune in.